evening, everybody. Good evening, and thank you for joining us here this evening. My name is Patrick Butler. I'm a professor of marketing here at Monash Business School, and I'm the director of our MBA programs. On behalf of the school, and along with my MBA Alumni Committee co-chair, Penny Ferris, I'm delighted to welcome you to this, the third in our series of 3 webinars on allyship and advocacy. And this evening's theme is Waves of Social Change. Over the last few weeks, our series has developed those critical social issues that resonate with the values of the Monash MBA program and with our MBA alumni community. I am privileged now to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we gather to learn, and the lands our voices travel across this evening, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'm always pleased to acknowledge and thank the organizers of this webinar series. Those of you who have been involved in this kind of work know that there's an awful lot going on in the background. And so to Deborah Daly, who's the chair of the subcommittee on community advancement, and her colleagues, Megan McDaniel, Solange Ardiles, Josh James, Burak Benatli, Vikram Soni, and Leland Rodriguez, I would really like to say thank you for all of these efforts and for bringing us together. I'm particularly pleased now to introduce my colleague, Professor Jacinta Elston, who will be our moderator for this evening. Jacinta is Pro-Vice Chancellor Indigenous here at Monash University. She is a leader in the Indigenous Australian community. She's an expert in Indigenous health and education and a major contributor to Indigenous affairs, research and policy development. Over to you, Jacinta. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick, and hello, everybody. Welcome to our 3rd panel discussion. I'm certainly very much looking forward to the conversation that we're going to have tonight with our panel. I'd like to also pay my respects and acknowledge that tonight here I am on the land of the Kulin Nations here in Melbourne. I'm a settler on the land of the Kulin Nations. I would otherwise be known as a Murray from the Curry. So North Queensland born and bred, grew up in Townsville, in fact, a bit of saltwater people. And but tonight I'm joined in conversation with 3 fantastic panelists, again, all living on the land of the Kulin Nation. And I'd like to start by just introducing each of them. First, joining us tonight is Abiola Ajetomobi, and Abiola is the director of the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre Innovation Hub. She's got a background in business administration, humanitarianism, accounting, financial services, and social entrepreneurship. She's had 17 years of experience in local and state government and the non-for-profit sector. Her current role in the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre Innovation Hub, she oversees empowerment programs and services that foster people seeking asylum's ability to thrive, their ability to thrive and be a part of the community. In 2015, she won the Future Leader Award of the International Women's Day Awards in South Metropolitan region of Melbourne. In 2020, she won ACU's first Entrepreneurship, Leadership and Innovation Alumni Award. She's a social innovator and a strong advocate for refugees, women and marginalised communities. Welcome, Abiola. Also joining us tonight from over there in Western Australian country, but is living here on the land of the Kulin with us as well, is Nichole Hayes. And Nichole, who moved to Melbourne quite early in her life, as I can gather, has spent many years working and serving the electoral office and has supported a few state members of the Victorian Parliament during that time. In her community engagement and development roles, they've allowed her to work very closely with the linguistically diverse communities, the CALD communities, and she's been able, through that process of that experience, to empower, encourage and mentor many young women to become voices for the broader community. She lives in Berwick. She's mother of 3, and she's currently employed as a national business and compliance manager for United Solar Energy. Outside of all of that work experience, of course, there's also a person who's an enthusiastic, self-motivated, engaged learner who's approaching life in a very positive way and supporting the people that she works with in a positive way. She recently completed a diploma of community development at Chisholm TAFE in the Dandenong, and she was nominated in 2018 for the City of Casey for their Australia Day Citizen of the Year Award for her service to Casey, to the City of Casey. And then lastly, joining us tonight is Fred Leone. And Fred is another Murray from North Queensland, really, or from Southern Queensland, I should say. But he's a respected community leader, strong Aboriginal, Australian Aboriginal, Tongan and South Sea Islander man. His family come from Garawa in northwest Queensland up into the Northern Territory that mob connect to. He's also got connections to Bachelor of the Fraser Coast region of Queensland's southeast coast area, so just north of Brisbane. Since 2013, Fred has been the guest curator of Clancestry's Yawa traditional dance event. Maybe that's supposed to be Yawa, I would suggest, but Yawa is sort of Torres Strait word really for goodbye, see you again, or something of that nature. Fred, I'm sure, will tell us. The biggest gathering of its kind in recorded history in Brisbane since the early 1900s. In 2014, he was responsible for the Indigenous content of the opening ceremony of the G20 cultural program, and he also collaborated on the official G20 World Leaders Welcome to Country ceremony at the Brisbane Convention Centre. He's developed his career working in performing arts and cultural heritage, cultural arts. He's a hip hop dancer, cultural community development officer, educator. He's a youth mentor. He's a current member of the Indigenous Advisory Group for the National Indigenous Music Awards. He's passionate about and committed to social change and to social justice, particularly applying his skills and knowledge to support strength, status and development of Indigenous culture. He's been a member of not just the award-winning Australian hip-hop band or group, I guess they're called, Impossible Odds, but he's also been a member of the Black Arm Band, a music band, Indigenous music band, and he's a founder of Queensland's only Indigenous owned and operated record label, Impossible Odd Records. So welcome to the 3 of you tonight, and welcome into this conversation. I'll invite you all to take your microphones off mute, because I think there's only the 4 of us, and we'll be able to manage that reasonably well and keep the microphones on. And you'll only need to turn them off if the dogs or somebody starts barking or crying in the background, I suspect. Look, this conversation tonight, as Patrick introduced it, the sort of ripples, how ripples become waves of social change. Our first conversation 3 weeks ago, we started with talking about, how we as individuals can create ripples and how we can start the process of change as individuals and how we can support others to move into that sort of notion of change. And then last week, joining us in the panel, we had another group and we talked about how those sort of small ripples can become bigger waves of change, if you like, in the context of how organisations and community groups can become engaged and active. And tonight we really want to sort of start to think about it more broadly in terms of those larger sort of social change waves that we can see and we have seen across society over the last couple of years. So because most of this conversation has started in the space of racism. That's where, at least for our organising committee, this is where this conversation started earlier in the year, looking at the issues of what was going on with the Black Lives Matter movement. And it has started in that space of saying, well, what can we do about racism as a group collectively? So I'm going to start there with that question. In fact, I'm going to, first of all, actually, before we start, I'm going to ask Fred, as is normal for our mob, Fred, you might want to do your own acknowledgement of country and acknowledge your mob. So I'm going to hand to you first to do that before we jump into questions.
Yeah, kalau ko jale maram janga buuro ganya yango ganya gamram jana bachelor jale nale daba minago barangam yirmi I was just saying that language that I'm speaking in, that's my grandmother's language. So Gari, Fraser Island, Maryborough, Harvey Bay down to Rainbow Beach. That's my family there. And I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land that we're all gathered on here. All of us are here across the whole country, but yeah, in our respective spots. And just to say thank you for having me come along.
Thank you, Fred. And you're right, of course, to acknowledge that for all those people who are listening and attending, they're all, of course, sitting either on Aboriginal land here in Australia, or if anybody joining from overseas, that too has its own Indigenous peoples in that space and in that place. And so we'd acknowledge, the people who've come before and the people who are still around, advocating and pushing forward. So to jump into this first question, I'm going to firstly say that if there are people listening tonight for whom this conversation tonight sort of raises any questions or draws any challenges or tensions for you, we'd encourage you to reach out and seek advice and support from, colleagues or friends, from the organisers of this. But of course, most organisations, ours included here at Monash, has a group called Employee Assistance Program, the EAP program. And outside of that, if you don't have that sort of resource in your own organisation, there's of course also groups like Beyond Blue and others where you can, call and have a conversation about things that might be challenging you or that you might be, feeling some stress or some tension around or worry about. So we'd encourage you first to do that. We, of course, very much want to welcome any comments or questions across this evening. And so for the people who are participating and listening tonight, we'd encourage you to put a question or a comment inside of the chat box that you've got access to. At about 7 o'clock, we're going to switch over and start to take some of those questions and those comments and feed them to the panel. But for the next 40 or so minutes, you're going to hear the four of us in conversation talking about these issues. So enough said, let's jump into the topic. The first question that I'm going to ask about is, how can we go about addressing racism at a national level here in Australia? Abiola, I'm going to start with you, and you might first preface it by saying sort of the context that you're coming from and the experiences of racism that you're seeing and discrimination, and then what you think we can do at a national level.
Thank you, Jacinta, and thank you to everyone as well. I would also personally like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands that we're meeting today and pay my due respect to their elders past, present, and emerging, acknowledging that the land was never ceded. But I always like to also finish my acknowledgement by really giving deep gratitude and respect for their willingness and sense of embrace that I've felt from the First Nation people since I've been here, and their open and welcoming gesture for me to call this country home. I feel deeply grateful for that. I think when it comes to the topic of racism has been existing for decades, for many centuries. It's nothing new now. But I think also for our nation in particular, to address it on a national level, we have to look at what has been happening in recent times and the challenges that we've had to face, both personally and also in our workplaces and on different platforms. I think I'll start by just highlighting some of the racial tensions that that I've experienced personally and I've witnessed happen. One is the media, of course, and the profiling, the racial profiling of media around ethnic communities and ethnic groups, and how that's kind of scapegoat mentality when it comes to conflict and tensions within our nation. And also, I think Black Lives Matters it's a big one that has happened to us this year. It's a global wake up and also a global reaction, but I think also it's a timely reaction as well, because I see Black Lives Matters, I see such events or such conflicts as something that can be transformational if we use it well, in terms of what it taught us, what is it teaching us, what are we meant to do, or what should we start to do now. And also, I think also another one is around the internal tensions as well, and the ignorance and just the idea of people feeling the sense of not wanting each other in their spaces and letting the privilege take the best of them when they are talking about other people and not putting other people in their own shoes or how the impact of those things feels on them. But I feel like if we're talking about addressing it nationally, we need to think about addressing it from our homes as well. What are we teaching ourselves? What are we exposing ourselves to? How are we relating to these kind of issues? And how are we raising our children and generations to come to have that kind of diversity and inclusion as a priority for them, and having that openness to welcome each other and welcome ourselves as well. I think personally for me, I've experienced racism in different aspects, whether it's workplace, raising the children in this country. Also my children too have experienced racism in different forums as well. But I think one of the things that I'd probably like to highlight here is that it's not about, I think I always say that racism is not about what you say. You know, people say what they think and there's freedom of speech, that's fine. But what the reality is, that is how you make people feel as a result of your speech, and that you have to take accountability for. And I think that accountability needs to be felt in our policies, needs to be felt, needs to be in our policies, in our reforms, in our legislation. We have not seen anyone being prosecuted for being racially profiling other people. You know, we've seen a lot from the media. No one is taking responsibility or accountability till date. You know, everyone is just trying to avoid the conversation around really putting really strong reforms out around this. This is not acceptable. We are in a country that is built, you know, by the generosity of the First Nations people as well as the multicultural communities. So I think that's as a nation for us, we have to address it. How we address it, I think also leadership plays a key role in addressing that. I feel that every nation, every organization, every community is led by a leader. And that leadership tone, that leading by example, walking the talk, is really important to really set the tone around what is acceptable and what is not, and also start to show the demonstration of what inclusion actually means. You know, diversity is good in itself, but we have to start talking about inclusion. And I think I always love the analogy of how inclusion is described in one of the seminars I attended recently, which is really it's about making a cake. You know, you put all these ingredients in, yeah, but until you actually put everything in and start to bake it before it actually comes together and molds and becomes an actual cake. So that's one of the things that we need to realize as well. Having that that notion of gender or identity around, you know, we need to count LGBTIQ, how many Black people, how many people with disability, and then we have this status and this ratio of diversity. I think it's not going to cut it for us anymore. People need to feel included. They need to feel that their voices are being heard. They need to feel that they are listened to. They need to feel that they are not left behind. So we could keep talking about this forever, but I think there will be more opportunity.
No, it's a great start, and certainly, you know, what you've introduced already, I think kind of gets to the crux of a lot of this. And Nichole, I mean, I think Abiola sort of calling out the fact that our leadership needs to really take action in this space. I mean, for you, one of the things that you're pretty committed to is the notion of the grassroots kind of movement. Can I ask you to comment about what you think, you know, needs to be done in terms of addressing from a grassroots point of view?
Yeah, definitely. And geez, Ebola, hard act to follow. Thanks for that. Geez. Mental note, don't come after you again. So
you can go there first next time.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that, Jacinta. I'd appreciate it. So when I guess every situation that I encounter, I have a look at I have to understand why something exists. Okay. And I look at, I'm a very solution-based kind of a person. So each year what I would do, and I still tend to do it, is I would say, okay, what am I going to campaign on this year? What is my member going to, what are some of the important things that we need to address? But as part of that, I need to have a look at, well, where is it stemming from? My son is passing me something from the floor up. My apologies. So I've got to understand, I guess, what creates racism, and we know that racism has been around for I guess we'd probably say from the beginning of time, and it's all about inequality in a lot of sense, I feel. Now and I also find that it's based on, a lot of it is based on fact, like fear and a lack of understanding. And we see these waves. So Ebola, what you're experiencing now, say for instance, within the media, back in the 80s, I saw quite a lot of that around the Greeks and the Latins and their gangs and so forth. And it was quite funny because I pulled up an advertisement from, or a newspaper article from from that period, and it was so bizarre. The faces had changed, but the comments were very parallel. So
That's interesting.
It is. And if you have a look back, there was a lot of gangs in like Dandenong, Noble Park and Oakley and so forth around the 80s. So it was, and they were all of a certain like culture, country, ethnicity. I struggle with that word, guys. And it's interesting to see how the media hasn't evolved. But what happens is as those people become older, then they get out into the world and they have children. Now those children then go to school, and those children are now part of a bigger community, and those children will go on, and a lot of the children may not carry the language that their parents come from, or they start to become first generation Australian, and you see that those mixes start to happen. So I have a lot of friends that are Chilean that are married to Greeks. I have a lot of friends that are Italians that are married to Greeks. So you see that amalgamation of the two coming together. So then you have, well, what language are we going to speak? So those cultural things tend to slip away, and then we become just us, and that's normal. I don't know
where
if
you've got these pockets of,
and you will,
I was going to say, where you've got these pockets of groups that are still kind of segregated or separated and identifiable, or new groups that come in, that starts to replace that and that sense of fear starts to get.
Well, that's right. Like, Abiola, I have no doubt that your children's children, there's a good chance that your bloodline will change a lot in Australia, and you'll end up, it could be that your great grandchild could marry a young man that's got Chinese heritage, and the bloodline's mixed, and then it becomes the norm. But I guess I'd have to ask that question, is how do we make the norm quicker? Like, how do we get these things done as a community? So I guess one of the things.
I was going to say, it's an interesting notion. And in Indigenous Australia, of course, we had a huge policy around this, which was the separation and assimilation policies, which actually sought actively to do that. And I guess, Fred, I'm going to kind of pass to you, I think, because I think the problem that we've seen inside the Aboriginal community with this notion of a forced sort of assimilation and what that then means in terms of people still feeling quite separate, that too has had an impact on where we are today for the Aboriginal community. And I do want to come to some of the work that you've been doing. We might do that in the next question, Fred, around the Black Lives Matter stuff. But I wonder if you were to comment about this sort of forced assimilation versus, the natural processes of communities getting along. That's probably, I think, the piece that Nichole's talking about.
Yeah.
I think in terms of, like, personally, I saw my mum. So my mum was, her parents died when she was young. By the time she was 16, she was sent to the dormitory in Cherbourg Mission, Albaramba Mission. And she was, that week, they started training her to be a domestic for white families in Brisbane. And, I'm 41, so my mum's only 60s, late 60s. And, born into the act. So when she was born in 52, so she was flora and fauna. She wasn't yet a human being, classed as a human being. And so to see that happening to her in terms of, it wasn't so much stolen generation, but to see that young people were just being taken within the community, within the mission, and taken and taught to become domestics and to become workers for white families out in the wider community. She came down and she escaped from there when she was 16. Took off. The first 2 weeks she was in the dormitory actually with one of my aunties, and so that was a sort of a personal thing. I think so. Looking at it now, a generation down, and seeing that, you know, the names of the policies have changed, but the game is still the same. You know, there's not much has happened in terms of moving forward or actually having some solid, tangible outcomes in terms of equality for all people. And I one thing I was thinking about was the politicization of race and racism. And, you know, it's a left and it's a right, it's a left versus the right. And I feel like that doesn't truly reflect, like, once it's stripped back to, hey, it's a human, it's harm reduction, you know, it's harm reduction. Like, when you look at what's happening to Black and brown people in Australia, in America, all around the world, if that was inside of a business in terms of a business model, that's not, you know, that's not how you'd want your company to run. So you'd look at harm reduction. How do we stop this happening to these certain members of our organization? When you think of it like that, and then think about it on a national scale, I feel like politicians need to, well, you know, the people in power and politicians, yeah, sort of, one, hold a mirror up to the rest, to the country, to Australia, and say, these are the things that are happening. And I feel like, as sad as it was with the George Floyd incident, and it just happened to happen in a pandemic, because we know this is regularly happening in the States. Aboriginal deaths in custody are regularly happening in Australia, but for there to be a pandemic and every young person, every young adult, every elderly person, nobody's able to get out. They're all sitting there on their tablet, on their phone, on the internet. It's in everybody's faces. And I feel like that was for an instance, that was like a global mirror being held up and sort of saying to the dominant society, what the hell are we doing? Like, what is actually going on here? So then to be able to be there in Brisbane with 35 to 50,000 people marching, and to see that many people come out and looking around within the group, within the people that were there, all the different communities coming out, like every different community that you can imagine. And not only with signs for George Floyd, but you know, stop Aboriginal deaths in custody, like, and the focus at the media. And as Sister Abiola was saying there a minute ago, the media, they have a lot to answer for in terms of their demonization of Black and brown bodies and lives across here in Australia, but also across the world.
I think that's a fantastic way to start this conversation, the three of you. Thank you, because, you know, you've highlighted, each of you individually, that what some of the challenges are in terms of how we need to go forward to address this nationally. I guess, you know, I'm wondering, what are the other ways that we see racism manifest? What are the other sort of examples of what we as a society can do about it? You know, there's a huge kind of, you know, chasm, if you like, between the way that we've approached these problems. And I think, Fred, your point was really quite important, that for the first time, we managed to be able to have this issue coming to light when everybody's sitting at home watching TV or watching their iPads or whatever devices they've got. And it was really hard to escape what was going on. So all of a sudden, there was an opportunity for everybody to be involved in discussion, be it a positive or a negative discussion. There was an opportunity. How else are we seeing racism manifest in our country? Gosh. Nichole?
That is and thanks for coming to me first. It's a huge question, because I think racism is everywhere. I mean, I've had people that have applied for jobs and haven't received the jobs And I've said, try it under this name. And they've received interviews.
Wow. Yeah.
When you're walking down the street, it's, 9 o'clock at night, you're walking your dog, a group of young boys are walking down the street. What's a girl to do? You'll see it. They'll cross the road and work on the other side of the street. It's, it's everywhere. It's not, and it, like Abiola was saying, it starts in the homes.
Yeah.
And I was all like, the Black Lives Matter movement was amazing. It was mind blowing. It was everywhere. It took up everything. But being a solution-based person, I wonder, but what did we achieve? Like, what really came out of it? It was great to see all those faces, and I'm all one for, for doing those kind of things. But I would rather see real change, not just a trend. And I guess with me, when I say real change, I seek out opportunity for young people, for older people, for women within the community. Go and get educated, get your skill sets, get out there, become leaders within your community, be heard. It's the only way that, be a voice, be the change that you want to see.
And it's interesting, I mean, as you say that, because we wanted to see change, but yet during the whole Black Lives Matter movement, particularly here in Australia, we continued to see, and in the US, we continued to see more atrocities being kind of perpetrated and showing up in the media. And again, I mean, Fred, I don't know if you'd like to comment on that, because while you guys were in Brisbane marching and, rallying the forces, there were a couple of extra deaths in custody that occurred in Brisbane during that time.
Yeah, exactly. We're there marching, 35 to 50,000 people, and then the news came through, another death in custody, So, and it hits home for me, because like a lot of Aboriginal people have been affected by it. I had a nephew who was found dead outside in an alleyway at a police station, and my cousin, my grandfather's side, was Muranyi. So, and it just gets exhausting. Like, it gets exhausting to be going to meetings and going to rallies in your teenage years, then in your early 20s, then in your mid 20s, then in your late 20s, and hearing the conversation just go spin around and around in a circle. And I sort of agree with Nichole there in a way about what happens outside of the Black Lives Matter movement. And so, but having experienced that my whole life and seeing it, and the irrational fear of, well, if I go for a walk at night time down to that shop down the road, what am I wearing? I can't be wearing this blue shirt. I'm going to have to wear a white shirt or a fluoro shirt. I'm going to have to make sure I've got my phone out, make sure that I'm visible, make sure that I'm seen. I'm wearing the brightest shoes that I can. There's all these little micro sort of thoughts that are always happening. And then they're always in reaction to like things, microaggressions that have happened over many, many years. One thing we did do in Brisbane after the turnout for the Black Lives Matter rally is I was one of the founding members for the Stop Black Deaths in Custody, Queensland Stop Black Deaths in Custody Committee. So we got a crew of concerned Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community members together, and we thought, okay, how do we take the momentum from this to the next level now and take it up a step? So then we formed a group, and then that group now meets regularly with the Department of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Partnerships, the Police Commissioner, the Health, Queensland Health, Corrections, the Head of Corrections, ministers. So there's a almost monthly meeting. And so whenever anything is happening now, which it still is happening, sadly, it's not going away, it's not going to stop. But there's some proactive steps being made around the country, I feel, but it's all little spot fires. But once we all link up, all our different communities link up, then then it turns into a blaze, into an inferno. And I feel like it was the first time in my life joining this committee and being a part of starting this committee, where I felt like, and seeing the turnout around the country, that young people from the dominant society are finally hearing the voices of the minority groups in Australia: Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander, the African community, the all the different communities that were represented out there, all standing together and saying, we can't. I don't want my son to have to go through this stuff and be going to a rally. I don't want to be having to, sit and talk on a panel about this. We shouldn't. The reality is, Australia's full of smart people. It's run by smart people. It's whether they want to use that power for good or evil. And the way that it's going at the moment, you ask yourself, like, I don't even have to say anything. You just look at how everything is. It's crazy. So, it all comes back to the people in power. How are they, sort of looking at it in a harm reduction way, that, they can sort of, what can they do to try to, be there for every Australian, not just the dominant society, and the rest of us sort of get sprinkled out over into, wherever.
Look, I think it's really useful that you've said that. One of the things that really struck me from our first panel discussion 3 weeks ago, which was during NAIDOC week, was a comment that was made as we prepared for that by one of our panelists, and she spoke about her experiences working with African youth here in Melbourne. And what really struck me was that same experience that she said that they were having is the experience that our mob have in Aboriginal communities, which is, what happens when a police person, when a police car rocks up at your door, what happens? And that kind of notion that if you're a person of color, if you're a person who's coming from a small minority group, if you open the door and the police are there, your first instinct is one of fear. And it's a different instinct to maybe for non-Indigenous people, or for white people, it might be also an instinct of fear. But for them, the fear might be something's happened to somebody that I love. Whereas for our mob, and maybe for others, for African mob, it is something's going to happen to somebody that I love. And it's a very different kind of notion in that context. And so it raises a different piece of this in terms of what we need to do.
And Jacinta, I will never understand what that feels like.
Yeah.
So,
well, just to get pulled over. If you're in a car and you get pulled over, what does that mean? Like, people of color, how they experience getting pulled over by the police versus how a non-Indigenous person experiences getting pulled over by police is very different in terms of the fight response and what tends to start to happen.
And even as I travel, like if I go, say for instance, I've traveled to, say, Chile. Now, when I go to Chile, it's not even reverse racism over there, the blonde hair and the blue eyed, and there you go. All of a sudden people are handing me cakes as I walk down the street. So, I have empathy for Abiola, for Fred, for yourself, Jacinta. I'm encouraged by all of your strength. And I love it that you're standing up and you're being proactive within your communities. I think it's fantastic.
I think the biggest challenge here, though, is that piece about, well, how do we build allies to come along on this journey with us? And Abiola, I wonder if you might talk about, leveraging ally networks. And obviously for the work that you're doing here, you must have a lot of people that connect to the African communities, to the asylum community, who want to be allies. How do you leverage that ally sort of network and that ally community for the work that you're doing? What are you kind of tapping into?
Thank you. That's a very interesting conversation. And I've just been soaking in all the things that have been said today because they resonate so well with me. But I will always say, before we discuss allyship, we should discuss how privilege, because I think also allyship could be contradictory if privilege is not addressed.
Or acknowledged.
Yeah, or acknowledged, yeah, and not addressed in terms of how you actually use it. And I think allyship, if I could define that very simply, is about using your privilege for the good of all. If you can have that deep understanding and recognition about your own culture, don't worry about my culture, worry about your own culture, your own upbringing, your own mental models, you know, how that is framed who you are and the way you respond to things and the way you treat others, then it's easy for you to have that level of deep empathy to understand how you can support someone that might be going through a different experience than you. Because people always look outside of themselves, you know, like, oh, this is our African community, we need to care for them. No, care for yourselves. The attitude you bring out to the space and the environment really, really matters. And I also think that when it comes to allyship, it's about active allyship. You know, you can't tell me you support me if you're not using your platform to advocate for me. You can't tell me you support me if something happens to my community and you go, oh, don't just tell them to not work out at night anymore and they will be fine. You know, like treating people, expecting people to be feeling less of themselves in a Western society like this, and using that as a way of defining what allyship is, because you're kind of telling me what to do rather than working with me and making me feel a sense of normality in society. I think also when it comes to allyship, another thing I probably want to say is that it's easy for people to be allies as long as they recognize their level of privilege and how that is playing out. And I think Black Lives Matters was a very, very important one. I came out in Melbourne during the COVID, so I acknowledge that. I had my 2 weeks of isolation and to pay for it, but I came out because it was something that was deeply important to me. It's something I could not, even my 18-year-olds, if I tell them I was going out with them, they probably will feel deeply disappointed. So it's a family thing for us. It was very important for us to be out there, but I was so encouraged around me. And I could say the population has not been as diverse as I've ever seen. Like, it's just beautiful to see.
That's what Fred said earlier.
Yeah, that's what I call true allyship. People are putting their lives at risk to speak up and to advocate for the good of others. And I think also we've seen BLM now create that platform for allyship, where people are now using their platform, their voices to really amplify other people and bring that issues to light of how things are happening. So I really feel that when it comes to allyship, one of the ways that we can actually leverage it is for that community or those individuals or the organizations to really look inward first, be able to look outwards, because the change outwards is not a lot. We're not asking for more. The First Nation people are not asking for too much. They own this land. Like, it's never going to change. That is never going to change regardless of how you feel or whether you're a fifth or sixth generation. You know, I've found people ask me on the train station and they ask, oh, where are you from? I gladly tell them I'm from Nigeria. When I ask them where they're from, they get upset, you know, like, get upset because I've been here, I was born here, I'm from Melbourne. I'm like, you're not from Melbourne, you know? So where are you from?
You even heard me introduce myself as a settler on the Coolan lands.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I'm an Aboriginal person, but I'm still a settler here. I don't come from these lands. And so it's really important that we acknowledge all the time.
Yeah, and I think that's, thank you. And I think that's the allyship will go a long way in terms of building that network and building an active network. If we can look inwards first and be able to deal with our own sense of privilege and how that is impacting on other people's and amplifying vulnerability for other people.
Nichole, can I ask you, because I'm going to ask you because you might be closer to this in a lot of ways. I mean, what are the conversations that you're hearing people talk about in your circles around, you know, becoming allies or getting involved? I mean, what's making a difference to, you know, why people will get involved or how people are getting involved? Is there a shift in that at all? Are you seeing it?
Yeah, definitely. I see a huge shift. I mean, if I think back, women weren't allowed to vote. Same-sex marriage was not something that was ever going to be okay. So you're seeing that social change come across. And the one thing that I will say with the Black Lives Matter movement was it was visual and you could see it, you know, and I'm so glad, Abiola, that you had that feeling, because I think that was something that a lot of people received from that moment, was they stood there along with each other and felt like they were part of a community. Unfortunately, in Australia, with our settlement programs and so forth, a lot of the time people aren't made to feel like they're part of a community. they're put in a house, like, there you go, off you go. Now we've got services here, there and everywhere, and good luck with that. See ya. And, you know, you're already starting off on the left foot. I find it exceptionally cruel. Like,
and so why are people deciding that they want to be allies? I mean, what are you seeing shift in
look,
society?
I think that a lot of people are seeing the unjust, and there's a lot more education out there. People aren't going until year 7 or grade 6 education. If you look at my mother's generation, my mother went to grade 6, and then she was sent to the family tuck shop to make sandwiches for the workers. Like, it's a very different, like, age that we live in. It's everything. My kids I jump on here and I've got to try and work out which button to push, and there's a good chance that I'll do the wrong thing and I'll look silly. But my kids come on here and they like touch things, push buttons, do this, do that.
Yeah.
There's already a change there, and the information that they seek is there at their hands. They get it. Like, when you've got world news and you've got an African village of young African women who have been kidnapped and tortured, and
I'm not sure if it's me or if it's Nichole, your internet.
I think maybe Nicole's internet.
You guys can hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. We might
I can now.
Oh, good. Okay, let's move on. I'm conscious of time, and we're going to have to head into the sort of Q&A in a bit. Can I ask what are some of the successful? I mean, you spoke, Nichole, just before about the the yes vote. The marriage equality that has happened in recent times with a huge amount of support. So I think that's one of the places where we can look to for successful kind of inspirations about how to move people's attitudes and things like that. Are there other examples of that, Fred? Can you see another area where we can look to for inspiration?
In terms of,
just the changing sort of perspectives, and we've lost Nichole. It must have been her internet. She'll jump back in, I'm sure. But changing perspectives in society, and so the yes vote. I mean, imagine 7 or 8 years ago, if people had started to say, "Oh, we're going to put a vote and referendum up about marriage equality in Australia," 7 or 8 years ago, that would not have gotten accepted.
Yeah.
But within a relatively short period of time, we had this huge movement. Are there other areas where you can see that sort of shift happening?
Yeah, well, I think one area that has really helped facilitate that, I think, is social media and the access by young people to be able to read, independent media, but also to galvanize their thoughts and bring themselves together in terms of like communities to be able to really stew on ideas and then put them forward on social media but also in a way that is catchy, and like there's just in terms of what you can do on your mobile phone, it's crazy. So making it look really cool and then getting those messages out in those ways. But the danger, it's sort of like a double-edged sword, because at the same time as having that happen with, say, young people or people that are conscious about what's happening around the world and the inequities and inequality that's happening, there's also people that are, on the opposite, on the opposite side of that, and they have just as much technology as these young people that are sort of using their skills. And like Abiola was saying there, for that story, if somebody is an ally, how do they not drown out the voice of the people that are going through the situations that we are going through, So signal boosting, how are they signal boosting us? So making sure that if they're, pardon me, if they're on social media and they're going to talk about something or address something, then reference people of color, Indigenous people, reference those people whose voices that they are wanting to signal boost, because, you know, yeah, there's that. And I feel like, yeah, I'm not.
No, I think it's a good point. We certainly saw, and noticed that Nichole's, we did lose her. She's coming back in, and I'm sure the group will put it back into our feed in a minute. So, but I think one of the things that I noticed during the whole Black Lives Matter piece was where we had people who were sort of trying to make comment on social media, there was a little bit of flack sometimes about, well, you know, why wouldn't you let a person of color speak about that? Why wouldn't you let them talk about that? And so this notion of, you know, amplifying the voices of others versus speaking for them. And I think this goes to the point that Abiola was raising before, is understanding your privilege. If you've got, you know, 200,000 followers on Instagram, they might listen to you, but what would happen if you amplified the voice of somebody else? And so I think that's a really important sort of piece to think about. Abiola, can I ask you, for the people who you see coming along on the journey to be allies in your work, I mean, what are they doing to become engaged? What are you seeing them doing, you know, to sort of when they're standing up and saying, okay, well, I want to be a part of supporting you. What are the things that they're doing to first educate themselves or to engage in, you know, that sort of notion of providing support, providing advocacy, providing allyship?
Yeah, I thank you. That's a very good question. I think one is really around understanding that you're ready, you know, that preparedness and that willingness and that discomfort that you have with staying silent, you know, like and having and taking a step back, you know, it's just that really drives passion and drives the willingness. And I think also people embracing their vulnerability. I want to be an ally, but I don't know enough, but I want to know. So help me to know better, educate me, and help let us work together. And it's about learning and sharing as well, because I think it's not one-sided. You know, there's different aspects to our culture and our values that can be exchanged in different environments as well. And I think also it's about promoting equity, not equality. And probably clarify that for those that are hearing this, because I think equality speaks to giving everyone the same access and making sure everyone has a fair go. Why equity achieve that? By ensuring that those that might be left behind are privileged and give space. I'll give you an example. When I started, I was working in an organization where they gave me 3 months contract, and we were 5 of us that were employed with a 3 months contract, but eventually they decided to retain 2 of us, myself and another person, and the other person was given a 12 months contract, but I keep putting back on 3 months contract every time. And every time I have to speak for myself, every time I have to advocate, every time I have to plead for another 3 months contract and another 3 month contract. And those are the kind of things that people don't understand, because I remember the lady was saying to me, I don't know why this is happening to you, Abiola. I'm so sorry, because if I'm let go here, I'll probably find another job before you. You know, like those are the people need to understand equity. And I think also it comes to the quota and merit discussion. You know, when people say, oh, why isn't it a fair and merit-based, you know, opportunities? Why do we have to have quotas and all of that? And I always say that quota provides access, or merit sustains that person in the role. You know, it's really about understanding those kind of practical ways to really amplify voices and create leadership within those communities to be able to speak for themselves and be part of that social change and activism and advocacy themselves, rather than doing it for them. Because I don't think we can better translate each other's issues as much as the people that are actually going through it translate it themselves. So I think in our organization, for instance, one of the things we've been trying to do is to really create leaders and create spaces for people to build their leadership skills and understand how to be activists themselves, how to speak up themselves, use our platform to bring people's voices to light and give them the space and the respect and the recognition that they actually know better. They are best experts for their own lives. We don't need to fix people. That time is long gone. People can fix themselves.
I really like that comment that you made earlier, which was, you know, don't try and fix me, don't try and help me, help yourself. And I wondered, if I just thought that was actually the way that you said it was fantastic, Abiola, because there is a lot of that kind of, oh, well, we need to do something for them. One of my Aboriginal colleagues in North Queensland referred to this, and it became a conference theme: missionaries, mercenaries, and misfits. And it's that kind of like, we can do things for you. Actually, you need to do things for yourself. And I'm going to ask Nichole this, and it will sort of put you on the spot a bit, Nichole, and I'm sorry about that if it does, but when several years ago when the Adam Goods issue started here in Melbourne, and I wasn't living here then, and Fred, you weren't either. Yeah. I'm wondering what it was like to sort of be in Melbourne at that time, because the conversation must have just been pretty overwhelming, almost like this Black Lives Matter movement in itself, that you could have this sort of situation where for weeks on end, there's an Aboriginal man being booed and booed and booed and booed in a football stadium. What was that conversation like amongst the community here in Melbourne, in terms of people making a choice to say, actually, no, we need to do something about this, or people either sitting on the fence, or people saying, well, it was wrong because of this, and looking for the justifications and the scapegoating around it?
Yeah, if you're talking in the circles that I sort of cross, it's kind of like, oh, it was just in fun, he's a sports person. Come on, it's he's out there, he's putting himself out there. What's the big deal? Like, yeah. They're all getting precious.
Yeah.
I don't think that there's fundamentally a great understanding on how much words hurt.
And do you think there was a piece like, okay, maybe for the first week that was the case, but then the second week and the third week and the fourth week and the fifth week, did we get to a point in Melbourne where people started to sort of question it for themselves and say, actually, maybe this isn't right, maybe we shouldn't be doing this? Did you see that amongst your sort of friends and colleagues?
I didn't see it as much as the Black Lives Matter, but I think that it called out uncomfortable, like Abiola was saying, uncomfortable feelings, okay, where people have to question if they're okay with it.
Yeah.
So
that's
I think
what makes me wonder about it. Yeah.
It was definitely a start where people started to think, and, I will continue to say, like with racism, you need to call it out. You need to say it's not okay for people to own what they're doing. It's everything's a joke, or it's all in fun, or come on, we can't have a joke anymore. But it's not funny. It's hurting people.
Absolutely. That was the reason why I wanted to ask you that question, because it came really nicely from, I think, what Abiola was talking about.
Definitely.
I'm conscious of time. It's 7:03. We do have a few questions that are looking very interesting coming in from our audience, so I do want to sort of shift to that. What I'm going to do before we shift to that, though, is ask the three of you a question which I've asked the other panels over the last couple of weeks, which is at the end of this, before we close off, I'd like you to all tell me what you would recommend that people out there who are listening, who want to kind of start to think about becoming more engaged themselves in, the issues of standing up against racism and against discrimination. What are the things that you would recommend? What's your top thing you'd recommend that they would either watch, read, or listen to? So you've got a little bit of time while we go through these questions to think about that, but I'll come back to you before we finish.
Jacinta, Fred's going to answer all these questions, isn't he?
They're coming to a few of you. So the first question I am going to pose to Fred and Abiola. So Fred's got his mic off, he might start, and then we'll move to Abiola on it. But it's what do you think, what are the synergies and differences do you see between the Indigenous and the African experience of racism in Australia? So Fred first, and then we'll move to Abiola. What are the synergies and differences?
Synergies. I was about 19, so this is just a bit of a little mini case study. I was about 19, 20. We're walking along, myself and two other Aboriginal young guys, my cousins, and we're walking down the street, and a paddy wagon pulled up, and immediately we looked at each other and we were saying, oh, here we go. And the paddy wagon pulled up, and there was a young African bloke walking the other way, and the paddy wagon pulled up, and we were waiting, and we were thinking, okay, here we go. for the interaction, and the police walked straight up and grabbed this young African bloke. And I looked at the other guys and we were in shock. And one of the Aboriginal blokes said to me, "Oh, these poor fellas, they're the new Aboriginals," like that. And that stuck with me like for many, many years. And I asked him once, I saw him years later, I said, "What do you mean by that?" He goes, "Well," he said, we've seen it growing up. Like, how many times have we been pulled up?" And he said, "And now there's another group of people in Australia that are going to experience what we've experienced." And so that was one just personal experience. Could I just ask, like, could you just run that question by me one more time, because there was something else that I had, but I just lost focus.
What synergies and differences do we see between Indigenous and African experiences of racism in Australia?
I think in terms of similarities, I feel like from the dominant society, there's this fear of the unknown. And it's always, like, oh, if there's 8 cousins that happen to be all boys and they're African or Aboriginal and they're walking down the street, that's a gang. That's definitely a gang. What are they up to? If there's, so I feel like it's in that sense,
The
that stereotyping and that stigmatism of both of our communities, I feel is rife.
Are there differences, do you think?
Yeah, I think there's big cultural differences. Like in Brisbane, years ago on the north side, it was just a misunderstanding happened at a basketball court. 2 young people got an African young person and an Indigenous young bloke got in a scuffle, and then this sort of like a poof was sent out throughout the community, and then suddenly all the elders just went, "Okay, we'll nip this in the bud, let's go." And then the elders just got together and sat down, invited all the young people around. "We're going to put on a big feed. We'll do," the local traditional owner said, "We'll do a cook up," invite in the elders from the African communities that were there, and sat down and had that conversation. And that was something that was a mutual, showing mutual respect for each other's communities over one little incident. That doesn't, I feel like that doesn't happen in like if in the context of the Indigenous community and the dominant society, that kind of thing doesn't happen. There's no genuine two-way reciprocal sort of give and take or engagement around it. Yeah.
Abiola, what do you think? I mean, what are you seeing in terms of synergies, but the differences as well between this racism experience of Aboriginal mob versus African mob?
Yeah, I agree with Fred, but probably what I will add is around the colonization, and the experiences of colonization and the impact of that on the generation, both African communities and the First Nation people. And also, I think we are all now doing the decolonization. Community that actually colonized us, like it's really you get exhausted. I agree with what Fred was saying before. You get overwhelmed, you get exhausted. When is this going to end? When are we going to change this? And I also feel that we are both victims of systems that are there to protect and support us, who are deeply, whose processes are deeply rooted in racism, and as an effect of that, it's actually working against us. And
it's really interesting. And so, as you say, decolonizing is an action that even within the African community that you're starting to think about. I mean, that's about the decolonizing sort of society, because even though you're not the First Nations people, but you're experiencing the same colonial kind of perspectives is really
yes.
So sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say the experiences are different in terms of the experience of colonization, but the decolonization effort is very similar and quite the same in terms of how we approach it and how we are all kind of pushing back now and wanting a different ways of being treated in society. And I think another similarity or another difference that we have is that we, as an African community, we recognize that the issues and the challenges of First Nation people are quite unique, and it's not something that we can be compared to us. And if they can go through the level of things that they've been through and still don't have treaty and still don't feel respected as landowners, who are we to ask for justice? Who are we to speak? So one of the things that we've been doing, and I'm kind of actively part of that as part of the Women of Color Melbourne, is to really try to create a society or a space where the First Nation voices are at the heart of it. So I'm working and finding that allyship, that's for us to really come out on a united front and seek each for each other. Yeah.
Wow. Look, I think that's fantastic. The next question that I'm going to ask is, what could we as a country learn from other countries about how to become better at addressing racism? Is there somewhere that we can look to that is doing this work? I'll go through each of you. So Abiola, do you have an idea of a country where you think they're doing this work and doing it well?
Yeah, it's something that is very disheartening when I'm talking about it, because the countries that are put up on the internet as doing this well as countries like Australia, because diversity and inclusion are based on gender and on representation and population statistics and all of that. That looks very colorful to the rest of the world. Well, how those people are feeling included in that society is a different experience. And if you're looking on the internet, I think I did a couple of months ago when I was talking about cultural intelligence to kind of investigate that. I saw Australia as one of the colorful countries because of the level of diversity within the country. And that comes down to representation and the demographics in terms of data. And I think data should not be doing that for us anymore. We need to start to get to the root of it. And if you want to get to the root of it, I don't think there's any country now that I know of that are actually doing better. Everyone has got one side to the story, whether they're promoting women equality or they are promoting disability access or inclusion, or they're promoting people of color, or we saw it in the American election around the Black Americans and how they came out in multitude to kind of, create that change for themselves and try and, use their power with their votes as well. We're just kind of seeing a society now that is really ready, that if either you give us what we deserve or we'll get it by force.
Nichole, do you think there's a country that you think is doing this work well?
I have to agree that I'm floored by that question, because I've never actually thought of it in that scale before. But no, I can't really think. Nothing comes to mind.
Wow. Fred?
Yeah, I'd have to
Do you
agree
think there's
with
somewhere? I mean,
both.
you've traveled to a lot of places.
I tend to agree with Abiola and Nichole, but I would say, like, in terms of dramatic change, in terms of like, one place in particular, it's like I feel like maybe we could talk about Germany in terms of what happened with the Holocaust and how the country has really made every generation after that happened really aware of what that way of thinking and what those values, the negative effect, like en masse, the destructive effect that they can have. I feel like maybe, like, if there was a
What about New
push-
Zealand?
Yeah, New Zealand, yeah. In a way, like with the, Treaty of Waitangi, I feel like they have, they're a little bit more advanced than we are in terms of that. But at the same time, it's just a piece of paper, and the crew over there, like I talked to, friends regularly, they are, what like Abiola is saying, like what appears on paper and what the reality is in a lot of these countries is a stark contrast. One thing I would,
and also I think that some metrics might look better than others. That's the other thing. But I think your
yes.
example of your discussion point about Germany is really interesting. I meant to say after we moved from that last, before we moved from that last topic, I meant to just let our our audience know, in case they hadn't figured it out, but the paddy wagon is colloquially what Aboriginal mob would call the police van when it pulls up, and the van that you get thrown in the back of it with the cage. That's our mob would always call that the paddy wagon, all through North Queensland at least too. We would refer to that as a paddy wagon. So yeah, just so that people knew what we were talking about. I'm going to ask about another question, and that is, again, it probably is more to Abiola and Fred, but it is about the negative impact of some of those microaggressions. And so Abiola, you spoke about, that 3-month contract and only being offered that all the time. And Fred, you spoke about microaggressions as well before. What are some of those microaggressions that non-Indigenous people or the mainstream sort of larger majority of Australia might not ever see? What are some of the big ones that you think make an impact to the people that you're working with or to our mob?
If I may, Abiola, I feel like, well, there's in terms of like the regular microaggressions, going down to say the supermarket, standing there and having a person look at you, see you walk up to the counter first, and then turn to the white person next to you and say, "Who's next?" Or "Can I help you?" Straight to that person, over and over. Like I literally would have a couple of $100 if I counted had $1 or $2 for every time that happened. The racial profiling, walking along and then getting pulled over. What else?
Can I ask you a question? How do you?
Yeah.
It wasn't too long ago. I was down at Mornington Peninsula. Sorry, Jacinta. I'll just
Go for it. Go for it.
It wasn't. I was down at Mornington Peninsula, and I've got a friend who's from Zambia, and he'd come and to be with some family and friends down there with us. I was showing him the Mornington. Now I walked into a shopping centre. And I was buying some food to contribute to the thing. And he was standing next to me. And the lady that was in the line in front of me, like, looked at him, looked at me, and was just horrified. And I had never, like, I got so angry. But he was just like, "Oh, it's all right. Doesn't matter." Yeah. But it affected me. And I said, "No, that's not right. Can you?" But I wonder if that's
a common occurrence,
a common reaction, because I had never experienced that before.
Yeah.
And it hurt me, like, to stand there and to be next to him and to see this woman who didn't know him, and he's the most beautiful man, just judging him and having this perceived opinion on him and on our relationship. I mean, we're only friends.
Yeah.
But, and that was only probably late last year.
Yeah.
That happened.
Yeah, that happens a lot. Like my partner's non-Indigenous, and we'll go up to where my family's from, Hervey Bay, and without skipping a heartbeat, every time we're up there, at least 2 or 3 times, and if we're there for a week, 2 or 3, 4 times a week, I'll be sitting there, we'll be eating dinner, someone will be shaking their head, or we'll be walking up and we're going to get a coffee, and just the looks of, what are you guys doing? Why are you together? What's going on?
One of the other common ones, Fred, is that whole issue about, if you are in a relationship, mixed relationship, the dark-skinned person, Aboriginal person, in our case, African person, it could be, who rings up to make an appointment to go in and pick up some keys to go and have a look at a property. Yep. And they'll, be then straight away told that the property's not there, not available anymore. But then a non-Indigenous person could walk straight in afterwards or ring up straight away with a name, that's very unassuming and very white sounding, and they'll get straight away. And I mean, that happened to my parents 40 years ago. and it's still happening today, that will get that sort of response. So I think that's one of the other sort of common microaggressions that I know of, is that sort of treatment of people in the real estate system.
Yeah, even checking into hotels, motels, you know, traveling a lot for work, and you get the look. Can I help you? Or you know, my partner witnessed it. I said, oh look, when we were driving down through a few regional areas a couple of years back, and I said to my partner, I said, when we check into these motels, you need to go in, because I won't, like, there will suddenly be no room available to me, because I've had it happen, you know, 20 plus times in my life. And I exaggerate, probably over 10 times, less than 20, but over 10
But
times.
enough that it makes you nervous about.
Yeah, because I don't want to spend the night having to sleep in the car, you know. And we were pulling through this area, and I said, look, I'll just give you an example. I'll show you. I'll go in. It's booked in my name. I'll walk in, and suddenly, oh, sorry, we gave your room away. There's no room. I walk out, get my partner to go in. 10 minutes later, pulled up around the corner, wait 10 minutes, and then you go in. Bam, came out with a key, got a room. I just stayed in the car, put my head down, we checked into the motel. And that's, you know, like, I don't want my children
I'm conscious of time, but I want to give Abiola a chance to talk about microaggressions that she's seeing here in Victoria too.
Yeah, I've been listening and writing a few things down and then crossing them off because it's been mentioned as well.
Same ones.
But I think mostly is that conscious and unconscious bias, and I think people of other people that are not of ethnic or colored community probably would not have to experience that for any reason. No one questions your identity, no one questions your sense of intelligence. You know, I've been into rooms before and people wonder why I'm there, and they just want to get so curious, want to kind of suss you out, you know, to understand why you are in the room and what's your level of intelligence and how do you qualify for position or awards like this. And I think also another one is around that sense of questioning your identity as well, you know, especially for the ones that come from a mixed race and people questioning their identity, you know, Australian enough, and then you go to spaces and you're not chilling enough, you know, like things like that. And that identity crisis that if it creates for the individuals, particularly kids that were born here and don't know anywhere else except being an Australian. Yeah, and I think also another one is around judging on looks, but the one I detest the most is around patronizing. Like, I hate it. Gets to my skin because I know it's not genuine. The expression and the words and everything is just, yeah, it just gets to me. And sometimes, you know, people have best of intentions, and how do you address that in a respectful way? Also another one that I probably think it's the microaggression is mainly centered around institutional racism. We've been talking about before, and how that plays out in different aspects, whether it's in maternal childcare or health system, whether it's in justice system, whether it's in political environments as well. And yeah, and just having to deal with all of that. I know it's really created a lot of sense of I don't know what the best English for this is, but really a sense of not wanting to try for some of our community, because they're just sick of being knocked back all the time, or sick of being told no, or sick of being addressed based on because of their color of their skin and not having opportunities that they truly deserve. So most of them just can't even be bothered anymore. And
well, I think the sort of language is one that's very disempowering and can create a sense of, you know, contribute to people sort of having very little motivation to try to change or to try to sort of actively go out and do things if they keep getting knocked down.
Sorry if I could add one more.
Yeah.
Here, which is around the empower to disempower, because I remember just you mentioning empowering. I think empower to disempower is another thing that we experience, where people said, oh, you know, we just want to give you because of your role, because of your intelligence or qualification or merit, but at the same time, everything you do get questioned, every step you make, and every report you write, everything will have to be looked out into the T, you know, just not giving you that freedom or that autonomy to bring your best to an employment or a space or an environment. Yeah.
Very, very true. Empower to disempower. Love that I love that comment. Look, I've done a terrible job of managing our time and getting us through as many of these questions and comments as I could. So what I'm going to do, given that we've only got really just 2 or 3 minutes, is I'm going to ask each one of you for a short answer to a couple of these. So Nichole, what other advocacy practices do you think could influence systemic change in Australia? A simple one.
Gosh, yeah, that was easy. I'm going over to Fred. I'm calling a friend.
Find a friend.
Fred,
Hi.
Fred, what do you think?
I'd say
What other advocacy practice? Yeah.
I feel like in terms of advocacy, you know, there's been a push on all levels of society and throughout all industry around you know, stopping violence against women. If it was something like that around anti-racism and started at the top and was pushed down, and something that was pushed out, I feel like once and once it's given that stigmatism of, you know, just don't educate yourself around why you're thinking the way you're thinking. I feel like, and once it's
education,
become education, I feel like once it's sort of pushed on those levels, maybe.
It's a great point. It comes back to that issue that Abiola raised at the beginning about the role of leaders. Abiola, the question I'm going to ask you is, what are some of the simple ways that people could step aside and create connections and opportunities for others?
Yeah, I think simple ways. I'll try and simplify my rest.
Maybe just one or two.
Yeah, I think one is about creating the space. You know, you cannot occupy all the space and yet wanting someone to feel included in that space. So creating the space and being intentional about creating that space. And also, I think another one that I'll probably mention is also about ensuring that you're checking in with the people that you're trying to advocate for, making sure there's nothing for us without us, like include them in the discussion. It can be time consuming, but it's a time that worth it, because you'll be able to actively and truly respect their voices in the way you go about things.
Thank you. Look, I'm gonna now I just want you to very quickly tell me your one thing that you'd recommend that people could read, watch, or listen to. So Nichole, what's your one thing?
Jane Elliott's 50-Year Experiment, Brown Eyes, Blue Eyes. I'm a firm believer that in good old Jane's words, where there's only one race and it's called the human race.
Fantastic.
So,
I love her work. Yep, great. Fred?
There's a podcast, and I feel like, you know, you can't know where you're going unless you know where you came from. And in terms of the foundation building of this country, from the dominant society's point of view, and how Aboriginal people were treated, and subsequently, you know, down generation after generation, there's a podcast by a young guy named Bo Spiron. It's called Frontier Wars, like the book Frontier Wars. Yeah, I'd say have a listen to Frontier Wars.
Yeah, have a listen to that. Abiola?
Yeah, it's a TED talk called The Danger of a Single Story. I think people may have listened, or I'll probably say listen to it again, by Ngozi Adichie, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie.
Wow, great. Thank you. Well, look, thank you to the three of you. There is a question that was posed, what do I hope my legacy for my work at Monash will be, and what part can the MBA alumni community play in assisting us in achieving this? Look, for me, I hope that the legacy is just this, that we're empowering more and more the people in general community to just take action, to become allies, to get involved. The words that you've all spoken about tonight, just let's get the leaders involved. Let's check our own privilege. Let's check our own biases. I love this empower. Don't empower to disempower. I think, you know, there's been so many notions that have come out of tonight's conversation. We just want more conversations like this by everybody in society. We want people to be consciously checking what they're hearing and what they're seeing and what they're listening to. And I'd hope that's part of my legacy, is that our graduates and our students at Monash go out being willing to check, go out being willing to be conscious in their conversations. It leaves me to remind everybody that there are places that you can go to seek help and advice if you need it, but to hand back over to Patrick. As I say, thank you to our panel speakers for joining me tonight in this conversation. So if we hang on, Patrick will come back in and join us, I think. There you go.
Jacinta, thank you. Thank you for all of that. Look, I should thank most especially our panelists this evening, Nichole, Abiola and Fred. You've given us powerful insights into these important questions from your work in the community, but crucially also, I would say, from your lived personal experiences, and we're grateful to you for sharing those. Let me thank you again, Jacinta, for your expert guidance of our discussion and for for those points as you summed up. Of course, I'm always pleased to thank Deb and Megan, Solange, and their subcommittee teammates. Cindy, of course, has helped keep the show on the road. In closing, I should say it's a privilege for the school and for the MBA program, and most especially for our MBA alumni committee to have hosted this series over recent weeks on allyship and advocacy. I would say again to you, to our contributors this evening, and to other panel members from earlier weeks. You've made a profound contribution to our understanding of these kinds of issues, and we know this is hard work, and I would say your work and your leadership gives us real cause for optimism on all of these fronts. So with that, let me say thank you again. Good evening to everybody. Stay safe.
Thank you, Patrick. And if our panel just wants to stay on for a moment, we'll close out separate to everybody else. But thank you, and thank you to everybody who listened.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.